Divorce and remarriage. I just posted an article by William MacDonald on divorce and remarriage, and one comment was left by AJ Louviere which I found very good and thoughtful. Here is the comment in full. The divorce and remarriage for adultery doctrine is based solely on the supposed guilt of the wife in Matthew 5 verse 32 and 19:9. However, the wife, in the above scriptures, is clearly not guilty of fornication because the Jews, that Jesus was speaking to, were still living under the law, and if fornication was discovered, there was a moral obligation to report the offender according to Deuteronomy 22 verses 13 to 24. The wife, who would have been found guilty of fornication, was subsequently stoned to death, according to the law, which had still governed the Jews up until Christ's death on the cross. The same for a woman caught in adultery, according to Leviticus 20 verse 10. How could a wife, guilty of fornication or adultery, under the law of Moses, be given a writing of divorcement and be caused to commit adultery with whosoever marries her, that is divorced? Jesus is clear, in these examples, that the wife is not guilty of fornication, but is still caused to commit adultery if she marries another man now that she is divorced. This is the only way that Matthew 5 verses 31 to 32, and Matthew 19 verse 9 keep harmony with Romans 7 verses 2 to 3, and 1 Corinthians 7 verse 39. Unlike the synoptic Gospels of Mark and Luke, which were written to evangelize the Gentiles, Matthew was written to the Jews, and has of 24 characteristics that identify it as intended for the house of Israel. The ancient Jews called the betrothed, engaged, husband and wife according to Deuteronomy 22 verses 23 to 24, Matthew 1 verses 18 to 25, and Luke 2 verses 5 to 7. Deuteronomy 24 verses 1 to 4, Moses' precept of divorce and remarriage, was never for fornication or adultery. Allowing those guilty of fornication and adultery to remain living and become a prospect for remarriage was against the law of Moses in Deuteronomy 22 verses 13 to 24 and Leviticus 20 verse 10, which commanded that those who were found guilty of fornication and adultery be put away from Israel and stoned to death. The law of Moses was not given to the world, only to the Jews. From the Exodus to Christ's death on the cross, the law of Moses governed the Jewish people. Christ's death on the cross caused the Jews to become dead to the law of Moses, so they could be joined to Christ under a new covenant. This is what Jesus' fulfillment of the law of Moses, including Deuteronomy 24 verses 1 to 4, Moses' precept of divorce and remarriage, means. Paul gave several warnings to Christian believers against keeping the ordinances of law of Moses as justification, over following Christ and his commands under the new covenant with Christ. Keeping the ordinances of the law is no longer possible for Israel, and that is why Christ prophesied that the temple would be destroyed. These scriptures make it clear that if you choose the law over Christ, that you must keep the whole law, Romans 7 verse 4, Galatians 3 verses 1 to 9, Galatians 3 verses 10 to 29, Galatians 4 verses 1 to 7, Galatians 4 verses 21 to 31, and Galatians 5 verses 1 to 15. Being unequally yoked to unbelievers is not a cause for divorce, once two become one flesh in a covenant of marriage, according to 1 Corinthians 7 verses 12 to 14. Many one-flesh covenant marriages between unbelievers are recognized by God in the Scriptures, most notably the marriage covenants between Herodias and King Herod's brother Philip, Potiphar and his wife, Ahab and Jezebel, and Ruth to her deceased husband Mahlon by Boaz when he took her to be his wife. Some are teaching that 1 Corinthians 7 verse 15 implies that those who are abandoned by an unbelieving spouse are no longer bound in a one-flesh covenant of marriage. The reason this is in conflict is due to the way some translations word it, which gives it an entirely different meaning and context. 1 Corinthians 7 verse 15 says, "But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace." As you can see, the actual scripture says not enslaved, which means that the husband or wife is not enslaved to sin with the unbelieving spouse, and is free to worship Christ in peace. Subsequent translations have changed the words to imply that they nullify the marriage covenant, which is not at all the case. The issue that this creates is with 1 Corinthians 7 verses 10 to 11, which says, "10 To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord: a wife must not separate from her husband." 11 But if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. As you can see, those who claim 1 Corinthians 7 verse 15 shows the Apostle Paul giving those who are abandoned permission to remarry, do not understand the command that Christ gives is to an abandoned husband, in 1 Corinthians 7 verse 11, and that he must not divorce his wife, and his wife is commanded to remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. The theory that 1 Corinthians 7 verse 15 nullifies two as being one flesh, due to one's unbelief, puts the Apostle Paul directly at odds with Christ and himself, by implying that Paul has issued an opposing command to verses 10 to 14 in verse 15. Some also teach that 1 Corinthians 7 verses 27 to 28 is referring to both divorced men and virgin women, and not exclusively to men and women, virgins, who have never been married. This has been falsely taught for some time in churches as referring to anyone who is not currently in a marriage, which, for them, also includes those who are divorced. This is a very false assumption, and puts these verses in a different context, that is at odds with both the teachings of Christ and the Apostle Paul. We see Paul refer to virgins, which signifies the unmarried who have never before been wed, which is the proper context here. We see Paul saying clearly that it is good for virgins, which is also speaking to never before wed men here, that it is good for a man so to be. He goes on to say, "Art thou bound unto a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife." Who is he referring to here? Men who, like himself, have never married. The word bound, in these verses, is a clear reference to betrothal, engagement, and not to a one-flesh covenant of marriage. The ancient Jews were considered bound as husband and wife during the betrothal, espousal/engagement, before becoming one flesh in a covenant of marriage, through consummation. This is affirmed by the context of the term bound seen in Numbers 30:14-16. The Jewish couples in ancient Israel, who were betrothed, engaged, were also bound together until death, either by execution for fornication, or by other causes. Then Paul says, "But and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned," which is who? The men who had never married in the congregation at Corinth. So he begins with verses 25 to 26 speaking exclusively to men that have never married. Paul then says, "And if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned," which is speaking directly in regard to virgin women who have never been married, within the congregation, not divorced women. Notice that verse 34 says, "There is difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit, but she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband." Paul speaks plainly when he says there is a difference between a wife and a virgin. Paul goes on to say, "But if any man think that he behaveth himself uncomely toward his virgin, if she pass the flower of her age, and need so require, let him do what he will, he sinneth not, let them marry." This is speaking of a virgin who has become of age to bear children when it says, "Let them marry." This is a clear command to a single man who has taken a virgin to be his wife. Paul then says, "Nevertheless he that standeth steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but hath power over his own will, and hath so decreed in his heart that he will keep his virgin, doeth well." This is referring again to the single man who decides it is better not to marry, but to stay betrothed, engaged, under the present distress, by saying that he hath so decreed in his heart that he will keep his virgin. Paul then says, "So then he that giveth her in marriage doeth well, but he that giveth her not in marriage doeth better," which again means single men in the congregation, who have betrothed a wife, do well if they marry, and those who choose not to marry their virgin brides do better, under the current climate. For more proper context of the word bound, let's look further down in this chapter to verse 39, which says, 39 The wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth, but if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord, 1 Corinthians 7 verse 39. For so long, these scriptures, between verses 25 to 38, have been twisted and used to enable divorce and remarriage, by wayward churches and teachers, and have caused many to stumble and to be trapped in unscriptural unions. The use of the woman at the well, in regard to marriage, falsely implies that Christ was endorsing remarriage after a divorce. This teaching is in defiance of Matthew 22 verses 23 to 28, which shows a woman who had been widowed 7 times, and entered into each subsequent marriage without any scriptural conflicts with God's law of marriage, one flesh covenant, seen in Genesis 2 verses 23 to 24. Mark 10 verses 1 to 12 and Matthew 19 verses 1 to 12 both record Christ's teaching that day beyond the Jordan. There is no mention of the words fornication, writing of divorcement, or divorced in Mark's Gospel because Mark was not written to the Jews, as Matthew's Gospel was, but to evangelize the Romans, and likewise Luke to evangelize the Greeks, who had no knowledge of the law of Moses in Deuteronomy 22 or Deuteronomy 24. All of these facts draw a clear understanding that remarriage after a divorce, under the new covenant with Christ, is a scripturally false and baseless teaching. Please use wisdom when living in any situation against what the Scriptures command.